Well, me and my trusty steed had a very pleasant drive down I-95 South this morning, and I recognize what an unusual statement that is. So I left Springfield, and here I am at the Virginia rest stop on I-95, and you might know there's a crash at mile marker 130, which is causing a bit of a traffic backup. So I decided to get out for a moment. I want to get off on mile marker 128. My goal is a place called Classic Iron, which is a big motorcycle store. And, well, let's figure out what comes next and head down there into Fredericksburg. Wowee, I'm in Classic Iron. Never seen so many bikes under one roof. Just a staggering assortment. And they talk Harley here, they talk Kawasaki, they talk Honda, they talk Indian, they talk trikes. They have a bunch of nice trikes too, standing behind me. Just talked to a very genial person named Red who explained what the differences on these various Harleys and bikes are. They have two Road Kings here. Very, very impressive dealership. Here's Classic Iron's collection of Indian motorcycles. My son likes the Scout, and they've got a number of those. Here's a Springfield, a bike I like. That's Indian's answer to the Road King. And a lot of these really, really nice touring bikes. Quite a few of them. You either like that leather fringe or you don't. After that very pleasant ride through green trees and forests, we've arrived at a feature of the Spotsylvania battlefield called the Mule Shoe Salient. Some of the most violent and bloodiest and worst combat during the course of the very bloody and violent Civil War occurred right behind me at what's called the Mule Shoe. It was a system of works erected by the Confederates that the Federals attacked one morning, and it resulted in very, very bloody combat on both sides. And I'm smiling because there's a lady dodging around me and trying not to get into my shot, not because I find any of this amusing. The Mule Shoe Salient. 150 yards ahead of you is the Bloody Angle, perhaps the most hallowed sight on any Civil War battlefield. The Bloody Angle is a small bend in the Confederate works within the much larger Mule Shoe Salient, a huge outward bulge in the center of General Robert E. Lee's 6-mile-long defensive line. For 22 hours on May 12th and May 13th, 1864, combat raged here. Confederate troops created the Mule Shoe on the night of May 8th, 1864, while attempting to weave together two lines of earthworks that ran at right angles to one another. Lee recognized that it was inherently weak, subject to converging fire from many directions. To bolster the line, he constructed stout trenches, fortifying them with upwards of 30 cannon. Even so, the salient remained his most vulnerable point, a fact bloodily demonstrated on May 12, 1864. Beautiful Virginia countryside now, on this very pleasant day. It's hard to imagine what it must have been like during the battle. There's an image that gives you an idea. Every Confederate realized the desperate situation, and every Union soldier knew what was involved. For a time, every soldier was a fiend. The attack was fierce, the resistance fanatical. Corporal John West Haley, 17th Maine Volunteers, who wrote a very, very good history of his time in the Civil War entitled The Rebel Yell and the Yankee Hurrah. Bloody Angle, crowded ravine. Thousands of troops covered the ground in front and behind you. The Union battle lines extended for nearly half a mile. Decades ago in the Smithsonian, it may still be there, there was a tree stump that was part of the battlefield. It was from a tree that stood on the battlefield, and the amount of gunfire was so intense that this very thick tree was actually cut down by the mini balls, the lead mini balls that were fired by the soldiers on both sides. That's how intense the fighting was. The question became, pretty plainly, whether one was willing to meet death, not merely to run the chances of it. That was said by Lieutenant James F.J. Caldwell, the 1st South Carolina Infantry. And here it is. Called by one modern observer the signature artifact of America's military experience, the stump of the bloody angle oak is on display in the Smithsonian Institution. Where the Confederate earthworks were located, well, are located, they're still here. Park Service wants to keep people off them to preserve them. That makes sense. I always like when the Park Service erects these things. This is a compass that shows you where we are. Fredericksburg is northeast, about 9 miles away. Chancellorsville, 6.1 miles away to roughly the north. Our next stop, the Block and Plank Crossroads, about 7.9 miles away. That's where we're headed. Very pretty and quiet here. This is a memorial that was erected in 2009 to the soldiers who fought from South Carolina. I've never seen it before. It's interesting. It's almost in the shape of a coffin, isn't it? Aftermath. At 2 a.m. on May 13th, 1864, General Lee declared a new line of works a half-mile behind you ready, and the Confederate troops in the trenches here quietly withdrew. They had bought the Confederacy what it needed most that day, time. But every minute had come at a fearful cost. It's likely that as many as 17,000 men fell killed or wounded in the fighting at the Mule Shoe Salient. It was the longest sustained combat of the Civil War. Piles of dead is often used as a figure of speech, but in the works abandoned by the rebels, piles of dead literally and without exaggeration were lying in the compartments, 2, 3, and 4 deep, tangled up with each other. Bodies and limbs intertwined, actual heaps of dead, their blackened, bloated faces upturned to the sky in all manner of positions and decomposition, already polluting the atmosphere with a horrible stench. It was such a picture of war, horrid war, as few people, even those who make it a business of war, are permitted to witness. It would take the pen of a Victor Hugo to faithfully describe such a scene of death and carnage, such a hideous and appalling holocaust of human life. Lieutenant Harvey B. Wells, 84th Pennsylvania Volunteers. This is one of my favorite places in the entire state of Virginia. It's the intersection of the Orange Plank and Brock Roads. It was the site of a major battle on the second evening, the second day of the Wilderness Battle. This is Army of the Potomac 2nd Corps country here. General Hancock and the 2nd Corps put up a very stout defense against the Confederates at these crossroads. They fortified it, dug in, and I can't explain why it's such a favorite place to me. When I was a boy reading about the Civil War in Burbank, it was just a country crossroads in the middle of the woods, and I found it really, really interesting. I come here whenever I'm in the area. Why? I just find it interesting. One reason this intersection is significant is because this is when the Army of the Potomac realized there would be no turning back, and it was on to Richmond, thanks to General Grant. Before the Wilderness Battlefield, stalemate meant retreat by one side or the other and a return to the starting point to try again and not another day. But not here. Union General-in-Chief Ulysses S. Grant rendered stalemate in the wilderness irrelevant. On the night of May 7th, 1864, as the woods around you still smoldered, Grant ordered the Union Army not backward, but forward, south, towards Spotsylvania Courthouse and eventually Richmond. That's where we just came from. As the Union soldiers quietly left the earthworks in front of you, they realized a turning point had arrived. And when, later that night, Grant rode among them, they cheered. They cheered not because Grant had won, but because he refused to lose. For the Union Army, 11 months of non-stop campaigning and ultimately victory lay ahead. Wild cheers echoed through the forest, and glad shouts of triumph rent the air. Men swung their hats, tossed up their arms, and pressed forward to within touch of their chief, clapping their hands and speaking to him with the familiarity of comrades. The night march had become a triumphal procession for the new commander. No turning back. I'm back at the same diner I was last time I came to Fredericksburg. Look what I see parked in the parking lot. A Volkswagen convertible, just like mine. And a Marine. All right, I'm back just after 4 o'clock. I left just before 9 a.m. A long day of motorcycle riding in interesting places. It's a good Friday. So now, time to get inside and make this video.